So welcome everybody to this auspicious professional team, as Professor Howley would call it, of industry and global thought leaders in supply chain. This is really a fantastic effort that TraceLink has been a catalyst and been prepared to sponsor, to put together a technology and vendor agnostic credo for healthcare supply chains. No need to emphasize this, but the pandemic has been sad because we've lost so many people and there's been pretty high drama globally around the pandemic. But I think the good thing is that it has really shone a light on how, I won't use the word broken, but how disrupted our supply chains are and how much we need to prepare for disruption going forward into the future. So, I'm Roddy Martin. I'm digital strategist at TraceLink. I have a background of leading supply chain research at AMR Research, which is Gartner, worked for Oracle in supply chain, worked as a partner at Accenture, and I'm now here, and it's a massive privilege to have the team that is on this webinar talking about the Agile Supply Chain Credo. So without any further ado, let me hand over to the team to introduce themselves, and off we go. Welcome.
And before I get started, I really want to thank you also for the opportunity to participate in this panel today. I think it's certainly very relevant, quite important, and really looking forward to the discussion. But I'm Mike DEEM, and I'm the head of Global Supply Chain, the Global Supply Chain Organization with CSL. I've been in the industry a little over 30 years now, so I have a fair amount of experience within the industry, and I've held a lot of different leadership roles covering the gamut from operational roles, sourcing, logistics, planning. Started in very entry-level roles in my career on the shop floor, if you will. I've also had the pleasure of leading one of the business or multiple business units within CSL, but one of the larger business units or subsidiaries of CSL, CSL Plasma, which is the business unit in which we collect plasma, the raw material that we use to manufacture our products. So I led that business unit and all facets of it for several years. I've also had experience in a short stint at running one of our manufacturing facilities in Kankakee, Illinois. So I've been able to see things from the raw material side of it, the plasma collection side, all the way through manufacturing. And probably even more importantly, from what I've learned over my career, I've also over the last couple of years had the opportunity to help lead an organizational transformation team within CSL that's really focused on transitioning us from what's been a very traditional and siloed supply chain to a globally aligned enterprise-wide supply chain, really with the remit or goal of moving from a manufacturing-driven to a demand-driven supply chain. So as we've talked about here in the Credo today. So for me, today's topics are quite relevant, and again, very much looking forward to the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, first of all, Roddy, for inviting me to be part of this very important session today. My name is MAEVE MAGNER. Excuse me. I'm an independent advisor in global health, working with governments, donor agencies, and also working with startups. My experience is also over a 30-year period. I cut my teeth in supply chain in the high-tech industry at a time when supply chain didn't really exist as a discipline. So I worked for Dell Computers. I worked for many of their contract manufacturers. I worked in all of the disciplines of supply chain, procurement, planning, distribution, and so on and so forth. About 12 or 13 years ago, I started working in global development, taking all the skills that I had learned in high-tech industry and applied them to increasing access to life-saving medicines in low and middle-income countries. I worked for several years with the Clinton Health Access Initiative, but I also spent time in Africa as the CEO of Africa's largest 3PL company. In that, I worked in many regions in Africa and got to see firsthand the challenges, but also the opportunities that supply chain had, not only to increase access to medicines, but to help in terms of overall economic growth. For the past 7 years, I've specifically worked as an independent advisor to organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Clinton Health Access Initiative, but also donors like Global Fund, Gavi, and more recently with FIND, the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics, on increasing the availability and access of COVID-19 tests. As part of the work I've been doing, I've also worked with startup companies and helping them to scale within these low and middle income countries in the healthcare space. And this, for me, I feel really is an important part of the healthcare future. The adoption of technology, the adoption of new and innovative ways of doing stuff. And I think it really talks to a lot of the credo in terms of the use of data, the use of technology, but also agility. I think we see a lot of agility in startup organizations that we don't see in the traditional organizations, but is putting them under pressure to respond. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today, and thanks again for inviting me.
Hi, well, I guess I'm next up. I'm Martin Christopher, Emeritus Professor of Marketing and Logistics at Cranfield University, where I used to head up the Center for Logistics and Supply Chain Management, which has become, I think, one of Europe's leading centers in the certainly research and teaching in this area. So during that time, I had plenty of opportunity to work with many organizations, and particularly in the healthcare sector. Spent quite a lot of time working with GSK, particularly helping them establish their Global Supply Chain Academy, which was their in-house and still is their in-house management development entity for developing skills in this area. My interests in logistics and supply chain go back a long way, but I think particularly one of the things that really brought all of this to a head was sort of round about the end of the last century, I guess, end of the 20th century, when a lot of focus was on lean, and a lot of good things came out of that. But also, too, I think there was a growing realization that it wasn't the whole story, that we had, in fact, increasingly to become much more focused, not on efficiency, but on responsiveness. And this, if you remember, was the era when time-based competition was becoming to sort of move higher up the agenda. So one of the things that I've been trying to focus on in those years since then is how we can actually create a much more agile capability. And that's why I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you very much, Martin. And the comments that I would make, just from the perspective of MAEVE and Mike and yourself, and I think it's ironic, by the way, that your title is Marketing and Logistics, right? Because today's supply chain, you could have said manufacturing and logistics, which would have been the old paradigm of Agile. And today, marketing and logistics is the new paradigm of Agile, because it's all about responding to demand changes. So I think, you were way ahead of your time in terms of defining your title. So anyway, let's have the next introduction.
I guess that would be me. And hi, everyone. Thank you, Roddy, for inviting me to take part in this panel. I'm really delighted to be able to share my perspectives. And so I'm a professor in supply chain management at Royal Holloway, University of London. And now I sort of split my time between academia and also working on supply chain risk and agility and supply chain transformation with different industries. And my journey started around, well, exactly 15 years ago, when I was appointed a research fellow of supply chain management at Cranfield University. So I joined Professor Martin Christopher and his team, I think really at the most opportune time possible for my career, because we were sort of really pioneering research within supply chain risk management, and there were some really great projects that I got involved in. And one of those areas was actually to establish a forum on supply chain risk management. And the idea behind developing that forum was that we felt that it was very important to share research and best practice with industry and vice versa. We felt at that time, this is now going back to 2005, that we still didn't really have that many clear benchmarks and best practice studies. And I think along with Cranfield, there was Yoshi Sheffy's team at MIT, which was probably the only other institution, if I'm correct, at least within academia, that was really delving into this really important topic. And if we rewind back from Cranfield, I started my research journey at Manchester Business School back in 2001, when I sort of stumbled, I guess, across a PhD, which I didn't intend necessarily to be on the subject of supply chain risk management. I was a lot more interested in the textile industry. But it was a PhD that transpired into supply chain risk, and I was really fortunate, I think, that I ended up with a great project, and since then I've continued to be fascinated by the topic, and I think it really lends itself well to what we're going to be discussing today, because as Professor Martin Christopher mentioned earlier, I think I sort of started in the academic journey when things really started transforming within supply chain management. We started focusing a lot more on demand chain, and we started focusing a lot on agility and the need for flexibility within supply chains. And certainly that lent itself really well to the sort of core findings of my PhD research, which was really establishing, the paradigms of like product design and supply chain risk management, and the importance of breaking down silos and creating improved alignment across our supply chain processes. So absolutely delighted to be here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And, the discussion that Mira and I have had about supply chain risk management, it's not something separate. It's not something you add on. And I think the challenge is, how do we prevent supply chain risk management from getting in the way of agility? So, John, I believe that you're the next, and then we have Alessandro.
Yep. Thank you, Roddy, and thanks for the invitation to join this illustrious panel. Good morning to you, I guess, and it's good afternoon to most of the rest of you there. Look, I started life as an engineer building major infrastructure projects, and I did that for, I think, about 8 or 9 years. And along the way, I was thinking about doing an MBA, which I did in Melbourne. And I met a guy called Mark Doctoroff, who at that time was a Fulbright scholar out from the US, and he introduced for the first time a subject called physical distribution management in about 1974 or something. And I suddenly, became interested in this topic and kept getting interested, wrote a minor thesis in it, and got to the point where I went home one day and said to my wife, I think I'm going to make a switch. And I started researching where to go, and I looked at all the usual suspects in the US, Ohio State, Michigan State, Harvard, etc. But I also, at that time, discovered Martin Christopher and Gordon Wills and David Walters, and there was a really critical mass of people at Cranfield, which had a new business school. And so really, we decided to go to Cranfield and do my PhD there. And I look back on those years as some of the wonderful years, because you're right, Martin was Professor of Marketing and Logistics, and it was really in those days when we worked together that I really got the early idea that if you're going to design supply chains, you have to design them from the outside in. That's where the original thought came from, Roddy, in case you've been wondering. Spent 5 great years at Cranfield. Eventually, the English weather I couldn't cope with it anymore, and we came back to Sydney in the early 80s, and did a bit of academic work, started my own consulting business, ran it for several years. And in 1989 was joined by a guy from South Africa and a few other researchers, and we developed this concept of dynamic alignment, because I was already starting to think that there wasn't enough theory, enough conceptual power, enough predictive power in what we had at that time in logistics and at the beginnings of supply chain. And really, I've been working on this concept of dynamic alignment for the last 30 years. In the middle of all that, I got bought out by Anderson and Anderson Consulting and Accenture, and went in there and started their Asia Pacific practice and ran that for about 8 years, and then retired from there in 2003, and then went back to pure thought leadership. And I've got a small group of people, and we've been working with companies in depth in the pharmaceutical industry, in the industrial industry, right across the board, and trying to, in a sense, make this concept of dynamic alignment a lot more granular. And I think we've done that purely through empirical research, and along the way we've tried to publish some things to get those points out there. I think, Roddy, you asked for, maybe commenting on a starting point, and I would say the starting point really for me, as you know, is the dynamic alignment concept. Martin's very familiar with it as well. And the first step in that is getting your customer segmentation right. I was very interested to hear Mike talking about his work at CSL, which, by the way, is an Australian company. We've seen a lot of companies struggling with this transformation question, and a lot of it is just been pure guesswork, because they've been, working on the inside, thinking that they're working on best practices, but when they look up one day, they find that the customer satisfaction really hasn't improved. So transforming your business from outside in, unless you're doing that, my view is you're guessing, you're wasting resources, you're following the old principle of one size fits all, and you're over-servicing and you're under-servicing, and it just doesn't work in the sort of volatile times that we're in now. You can get away with it in good times when there's lots of growth, but in volatile times like we're in now, and will be for the foreseeable future, you have to be a lot more precise in the way that you design your supply chains to cope with the different degrees of agility that we're going to need and we're going to see amongst our customers.
Yeah, so that's, if I just quickly scoot through the team that has introduced themselves up until now, when you think about it, Mike, who's living with the real world scenario of supply and demand and massive volatility in a very critical industry. When you think about Martin Christopher and marketing and logistics being way ahead of its time and really the basis of agility as we understand it today. MAEVE emerging in low-income markets where they don't have, and I'm not saying they don't have sophisticated systems, but they don't have the benefits of the high-tech world that we live in perhaps in the first world, if I could call it that. Certainly AMERA, supply chain risk management, how do we prevent that getting in the way of agility? Because we can absolutely, it's like the old sourcing and procurement. You can be a stickler and stop the supply chain. John GATTORNA looking from the outside in, and if you have a better understanding of how to segment the outside, you're probably going to be more prepared for the inside. So let's go to Alessandro, because Alessandro, I think, is a very interesting, point that I love, especially in respect of Alessandro's background, is Alessandro amusingly at our last conference called it the patient-driven supply network. Now, P&G invented the consumer-driven supply network. So, Alessandro, over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Roddy. That's great. So first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation to this panel. And thanks a lot for developing the credo that I think is absolutely right on. Absolutely right on. So my experience, I've been 30 years in the industry. I started in the 90s, late 80s, as a matter of fact, in Procter & Gamble, where I spent 20 fantastic years. I had the opportunity to meet Roddy there. I had the opportunity to be taught about supply chain from Professor Martin Christopher. So 20 years in operation and supply chain. And then around the year 2000, there was the first crossroad of my life. And I was offered to join another fantastic company and moving from fast-moving consumer good to pharma. And then I entered the fantastic world of pharma and healthcare, joining Merck KGaA. And I started to run the global supply chain in Merck Healthcare. And obviously, we found challenges that we discovered in fast-moving consumer goods some years ago, and we start our implementation and acceleration journey to improve it. Then after, let's say, 6 years in supply chain, I had my second crossroad, and I moved from supply chain to digital. And now I'm the CIO of Merck Healthcare, and I'm in this other great world of digital that is definitely, I wouldn't say the future, it's the present. Digital is in everything we do, and digital is really what I consider the sort of empowerment, enhancement of supply chain. I mean, really connecting the two worlds together is the best that could happen. I remember when I started working supply chain in P&G, I was dreaming about the digital solution that today's are commodities. So I think we should leverage it definitely to improve our supply chain. And going back to our credo, I mean, I can only applaud this team. I can only applaud RODDY, because this is exactly what we should do. This is exactly moving towards the patient, moving towards this patient-driven supply network, moving towards collaboration across the different silos is exactly what we need to do together. It's exactly what we can do together, and we'll have to do it now.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Alessandro. And, I just want to emphasize again the point of the credo, right? I mean, this is not a step-by-step approach on how you can sort of instantly get agile on a spoon. The idea was to provide some really high-level strategic, I hate to call them common sense, but all of us know that when you read these, this is nothing new, but it's a combination of guiding principles, a North Star, and operating thoughts to design your supply chain around. And I think this is the opportunity for a big wake-up call in the industry. So let's kick off with the next phase. And again, each of you have domains of speciality that you are famous for. And I'm going to ask Mike DEEM, leading and managing change, obviously, without necessarily dwelling on your particular company, but leading and managing change, transformational change in an industry where we're dealing with a pandemic. What really jumps out at you about the credo?
Sure. Thanks, Roddy. So yeah, as I thought about this a little bit and coming into this and really thinking about the current pandemic, certainly, it's challenged organizations in ways that they've never been challenged before. Much more so than I think the past crises or natural disasters that people have dealt with. And it really is, I look across our organization and I talk to peers in other organizations. I think it's those organizations that, first of all, really have a strong set of values to fall back on that have been able to best navigate through this pandemic so far. At CSL, we routinely talk about our values, such as patient focus. I mean, we're a very patient-centric organization. Patient focus is core to everything we do. But obviously, along with that, innovation, collaboration, and really from the start of the pandemic, it was really clear to us that we needed to make, safeguarding our employees, our patient, our plasma donors, our number one priority to help manage through this and make sure that we do remain agile and continue with reliable supply to our patients. So I think really by having a clear line of sight on these types of priorities, it's made it a lot easier for us within CSL to be much more agile in our decision making, be much more focused, be much more responsive to the needs of our patients in a very rapidly changing environment as we've tried to manage through the pandemic, while at the same time, to going through a leadership transformation within our organization. I think it's certainly highlighted, to all of us in healthcare supply chains that, we need to have a global mindset in everything we do and how we think about our businesses, how we think about the markets, how we think about patients. Once again, being very patient-centric. And really, you have to be ruthlessly focused on agility, responsiveness, and resiliency within your organization to really be successful in this and really change the culture of supply chains and how supply chains, work in today's environment and where we really need to go forwards as we think about the credo and just our ability to remain very agile and be, as everyone has said, looking from the outside in and looking from the patient view. It's not an easy thing to do. And I think if companies aren't very ruthless about it and aren't ruthlessly focused on it, it's not something that will happen. As we look, looking at this current pandemic, I think it's a great wake up for us. This is not going to be a one-time event that we're going to have to address. It's going to require organizations and their supply chains to really flex all their muscles in new ways and different ways than what they've had to really be able to adapt as this situation, evolves over the next X number of months. The impact of this is going to be over years, and we're going to have to continue to evolve and think about our agility and what does that mean for each individual organization to be able to respond to the impact of this. Certainly supply chain agility is becoming more and more critical for business success in general. Patient expectations are changing. Patient expectations continue to get higher. As I think about personalized medicine, I think it's going to be quite interesting in the impact that that's going to have on supply chains and the pressure that it's going to put on supply chains to become even more agile than probably what we're even thinking about today. And kind of to piggyback off of where Alexandra was at, for me, a lot of it comes back to data and the technology. And I think one of the things that where it really has to start, and where organizations the best place to start, is with really accurate real-time data that's shared transparently across organizations. I still see big tendencies for organizations to work in a siloed fashion, and people want to work within their function and understand and sort of digest information before it gets shared with other parts of the organization. And we have to get past that. We got to really start to share transparently across organizations data on a real-time basis and treat it as a single source of truth for the entire organization. And from my view, without this, effective collaboration, quick decision-making just can't happen in today's, global complex organizations. And if we don't start to do this and start to move in a more agile way of thinking and acting, ultimately it's the patients that are going to suffer as we move forwards into the future. So just a few thoughts from my view, and with that, I'll hand it over to MAEVE.
Yeah, that's great. And if I can just draw out a point, I mean, one of the nuggets that you and Paul talk about, Paul McKenzie as the COO of CSL, is this idea of having, reliability rooms that literally on a daily or a regular basis look at issues that disrupt the supply chain and deal with them, as soon as you possibly can, because as I said in the lead up to this webinar, CSL has the worst of all worlds, if you may call it that. I mean, you've got variable demand and you've got variable supply. You can't predict where your product is coming from accurately on the supply side. So to balance that, you have to be absolutely on the mark on any issue that is going to disrupt the supply chain. And I think that reliability focus and Paul's language of look for the smoke signals. I got to understand where the smoke is. Is it a fire or is it just a little wisp of smoke? And be able to jump on that. I mean, that's really embedded in all of the principles of the Credo. You absolutely walk through every one of them and find why you would want to have a continuous monitoring of agility. So, MAEVE, over to you.
So the pandemic, I think, has been quite interesting from my perspective because I'm used to dealing with a lot of, smaller pandemics like Ebola in low and middle income countries. And when that happens, there is some notice within the developed countries, but not a lot. Everybody gets on and does their own business. And in these low and middle income countries with very limited resources, they have to learn to deal with this, and they put, they become very resilient, really, and they put the appropriate processes and everything in place. And when the pandemic hit, actually, I think especially Africa was probably in a better position than most other countries to respond, because they immediately shut down inbound travel from the developed countries. And they put in place some of the processes that they had already put in place previously for Ebola and for other stuff. But for the pandemic, for me, it became a global conversation. Everybody talked about COVID-19. Everybody. There wasn't any country, there wasn't any individual that wasn't talking about it. So for me, it was really interesting to see for the first time that we had this global conversation. And as I said, I believe that the low middle income countries probably responded better to it initially. And again, that's back to their resilience. What was also quite interesting for me is that it became the burning platform for a lot of change, and a lot of this change, both in developed and underdeveloped countries, was the move to digital and the adoption of digital tools, the adoption of technology. What might take, years to get through policy and to get agreements on, or to get through the bureaucracy, got approved and implemented overnight, because the technology was there, and really what was stopping it was either the bureaucracy within organizations or regulations within governments. However, I do feel that when it comes to the patient-centric, I feel that that's not happening at all. When I look at the supply chain and we see that with limited availability of PPE, limited availability of tests, and even though the vaccine isn't out already, we don't have a vaccine, there's already a big scramble for, who's going to get it, how are you going to decide who gets it? And quite frankly, that's not a conversation that is patient-centric. It's actually very much around who's got the money, who's got the power, who's got the influence, etc. So I feel that in some ways we've made a lot of leaps forward, and have made decisions around being able to use the tools and the technology that are there. But in other parts of the supply chain, I feel that we've actually gone in the reverse. And I'm hoping that that will settle once that, we have a better idea of the supply and the demand sides of it. In the low and middle income countries, they have been at a huge disadvantage, though, because with the US, Europe, and even Australia putting out so much money to acquire the appropriate PPE, to acquire all of the tests, to already, putting money into big pharma companies to develop the vaccines, they're actually being left behind. And so there is a couple of global initiatives that have been put in place to make sure that they will have access to affordable and quality diagnostics and affordable and quality vaccines when they come through. So it's really, from a supply chain standpoint, it's been a really interesting journey in the low and middle income countries. But what has also, I think, been very powerful is that it has increased the knowledge around supply chain and the decisions that organizations make about where their products are manufactured, how their products get, moved between countries. We've also seen that for a lot of the products coming into Africa, into the African countries, that there is a lot of not lenience, but there's emergency regulation put in place to actually improve the speed of those products coming into the countries. And I think that that has actually been very helpful as well. But then we do worry about, the quality of the products coming through. So that is another thing that we have to look at. It has also raised this whole question around risk management. What are some of these risks that we haven't been able to foresee, and how do we address this? How do we think about this? So for me, I think it's a very interesting time in terms of the supply chain discussion. And because the pandemic is going on for as long as it is, and like Mike said, this isn't going to be, the last one. We're going to see this as a matter of course over the next decade or so. So I think that it actually helps people to shift into that mode of more agile decision making, and knowing that they will need to have flexibility within the supply chains, and they do have to think about them differently.
Maeve, I think as you were talking, I was thinking about my favorite topic, which is, where are you on the 5 stages of maturity, from reacting to problems to operating as a true patient-driven network? And I couldn't help thinking, as I was listening to your words, that maybe Africa or emerging low-income markets are just at the supply reliability stage of the maturity journey. Whereas other countries, and we're going to hear from John GATTORNA, it's about, and especially in what Mike said, about demand forecast accuracy from patients, and then having demand side accuracy. So I think that in good time, one hopes that emerging and low income markets get a better appreciation of what actually downstream is all about. But they first got to get supply reliability right, and I couldn't think of a better point of transition here to Martin Christopher.
Well, thanks, Roddy. Yeah, I think we're at a very interesting point in time in the way in which organizations are starting to think about, well, the whole sort of business model in a way, not just their supply chain. Because if you think about it, for decades, probably for centuries, businesses have been, forecast driven. We've been able to look ahead. We've been able to plan with a certain degree of certainty. So that drove our manufacturing strategy. So we focused on efficiencies, economies of scale, because generally speaking, you could make ahead of demand, and things worked out okay. Well, of course, all that's changed. I think it's even obviously predates COVID, of course it does, but it's become something of a cliche to say that we're living in a turbulent and volatile world. But I think the point of the story is that the old methods worked pretty well when you had stability, when you could sort of plan ahead with a reasonable degree of confidence. In today's world, where every day is different and who knows what tomorrow's going to bring, I think there's going to be a significant mindset change. And this, I think, is the big issue, basically. We know all about agility. We've been talking about agility for a long time, actually. I mean, if you want to trace back its history, it goes back to things like flexible manufacturing systems, back in the closing years of the 20th century. But nothing's actually changed inside the organization, I think. And this to me, is the big issue. It's basically saying, how do we make that transition? Well, a transformation, again, a word that's widely used today, from being very much a sort of inwardly focused business based around efficiencies, lean, all these things. And the metrics, of course, also, too, that we've used have encouraged that sort of way of thinking, that way of doing things. So I think if we're really serious about making this change, and we have to make this change, because as everybody already in this brief discussion so far has highlighted, is that these times are so uncertain, and we know that the future is also going to continue in the same way. So this, I think, is my starting point. It's about being willing to invest in capabilities that are going to improve our responsiveness, obviously our resilience. We'll hear more about that later. But particularly, I think, in how we do things in a totally different way. Because if you think about what are the capabilities required by an agile organization and an agile supply chain, the first one obviously is based around time. As I said before, we can trace back the origins of a lot of our thinking on agility to this idea of time-based competition. So focusing on velocity, what is it that's actually slowing us down? And as we heard earlier, one of the challenges in organizations is the fact we're still working in silos. It's organizational as much as anything. So we've talked about these issues for as long as I can recall now, but maybe if there's a silver lining coming out of this crisis, it will be, in fact, that this is the ultimate sort of burning platform that's going to drive that sort of change. So my view basically would be that it has to begin inside the business. It's got to begin, first of all, as I say, with the mindset, recognizing that we are in a different world, and that yesterday's solutions aren't going to work in today, and certainly not in tomorrow's sort of world. And then to look very hard at how we organize inside the business to start with. We can't talk about integrating the supply chain if we're not integrated across our own silos inside the organization. And then secondly, reaching out to supply chain partners, recognizing that, to use the cliche, that we are all in this together. And the only way forward is literally to work on a totally different basis, breaking down those external barriers, once having broken down the internal ones. We could talk all day about this, Roddy, but I think basically that's my sort of pitch in terms of what we have to do to move forward.
Very well put. And again, I think that you were way ahead of your time when you gave yourself the title Marketing and Logistics, because what you've just described is exactly that. And I think we're going to hear that from Alessandro and from John GATTORNA. I mean, if you can't understand and get insights on what's changing on the outside, how on earth can you codify the business inside to be responsive? You just can't be prepared for every single set of circumstances. So very, very well put. And over to you, Amira, to talk about supply chain risk management, because at the end of the day, we can lock down the business with risk management, so you can't do this and you can't do that, unless we have a pragmatic way of embedding it into the operating model of the business.
Absolutely, Roddy, and I'd like to echo many of Martin's comments before. I think that I completely agree as well that this is an internal issue. I think experience shows that there's been a lot of information, there's been a lot of knowledge out it means to be truly agile, but I believe that organizations haven't really fully embraced the concept of supply chain risk management and how agility can bring about resilience. So if I could just say a few words on where I believe that there's been some challenges, is that I think when we think about how supply chain risk management as a concept has evolved over the years, by many companies, it's been more like a tick box exercise. It's kind of the thing that we just need to do on the side for compliance, and but without truly recognizing the disruptions that are out there on the horizon, and what will we do if it takes out a key supplier, or what will we do if we get our next product range wrong, right? So I think that one of the things that I think has been quite important to me is that, and I really discussed this in my PhD thesis as well, was that we should no longer just simply talk about supply chain management, but it's about supply chain risk management. And we shouldn't fear that it is supply chain risk management, because risks obviously can bring about a lot of opportunities for us as well. But I think over the years, there's been a focus of supply chain risk management more towards cost. And I think that's where a big part of the problem has been, is that when we've started thinking about supply chain risk management strategies, we have favored cost over responsiveness. And I think there's been a failure of many managers not recognizing that the route to true resilience is actually by having a much more responsive supply chain. And again, it's not about just the firm, it's not just the focal firm being responsive, it's also the extended, the supply chain partners. But I think if we don't break down our internal silos in a company, then we certainly can't talk about true agility and true responsiveness across our supply chain. So I think that we are still seeing companies with the same challenges, same problems over the last 15, 20 years, right? They haven't managed to really grapple with the fact of how to truly design a resilient supply chain. And I think that as many of the experts on the panel have already said, saying it's a wake-up call is also cliche, right? We said that after 9/11, we said that after many disruptive events, and we're saying it again, that this is a wake-up call, and it is one that is a very different wake-up call. I think the challenges that many industries are facing today are hopefully going to make managers maybe press the reset button, because I think it's time today to really perhaps redefine the concept of supply chain management and the concept of supply chain risk management. I think achieving resilience 15 years ago perhaps had a very different foundations than it has today. And I think that in that journey to achieve true resilience, we also need to basically change our business models. We need to change our approaches. And that means investing in our capabilities. It basically means upskilling our supply chain profession in new ways. And I think that being a professor coming from academia, I would probably like to be a little critical that we are probably part of the problem here, in that where we do train graduates and future supply chain professionals also in silos, some could say. And I think that almost the supply chain profession as it's taught needs to change a little to make sure that the future graduates becoming the future supply chain professionals are equipped with the right skills for the next generation supply chains, which are a lot more digital, which require a lot more soft skills. And we need to take ownership of that. We need to do a fundamental curriculum design in order to make sure that the supply chain profession is moving in the right direction. So I think there's many challenges, and just to give you again an example of how the academic sector has been hit by COVID-19 as well. It's been quite a disruptive change for universities in the US and in the UK, because we've been very much built on a model which relies and is dependent on international students. And of course, if those international students don't come on our programs, it's a big issue. But the biggest disruptive event has been that we're not going to have students in our classes, and we've had to go digital. And I can't tell you the impact that's actually had on academics who basically don't know how to do the very basics of digital or online teaching. So there's a lot of changes, and that's just a very simple example I'm giving of a disruptive change hitting one of the most one of the oldest sectors on the planet. So and that change doesn't really come with it comes with a lot of difficulties. Change hurts people. It brings a lot more uncertainty, and that compounds even more problems. And I think that one of the things we're going to see also going forward as a result of COVID-19 and part of our supply chain risk management process is that how do we continue to manage uncertainty? How do we continue to manage the complex world that we're in? Because there's no doubt we have created a lot of complexity in our supply chains. And I think going forward, we need to buffer that out both upstream and downstream in the supply chain. And as we've talked about before, Roddy, I was saying in our earlier conversations that I think we and as Martin mentioned before, we were pretty good at forecasting demand. We were quite sophisticated tools and technologies that helped us do that. But I think how we translate that demand upstream in the supply chain is another thing, and how do we get all the pieces together, I think is going to be a continued challenge, particularly when we also add in the sustainability angle and the digital angle. So there's so many new facets that we need to focus on here.
Yep, thank you very much, Amira. And I think let's put the pressure on John, right? If we're prepared from the outside in. And I'm teasing you a little because I think that this healthcare industry is so ready for a new view of segmentation. If you prepared and you understand and have insights about demand driving behaviors, that's an element of preparedness that you can prepare for in every sense that all of us have spoken to. So John, let's hear a little bit about this demand driven outside in segmentation, which I think the industry is so ready for.
Okay. Well, I think, the thing that fascinates me about the pharmaceutical industry is that it's an industry with incredible technology and incredible science. And yet when it comes to supply chain, the science is missing. And I think the challenge to, our friends here who come from pharmaceutical industries and companies is to lift the science of the supply chain up to somewhere near the science of the product. But look, coming late in the scene as you are is not a bad thing. You can learn a lot from the high tech and the apparel industries, fashion industries, FMCG. But I think one of the big challenges that we're facing in the pharmaceutical industry, it's got quite a complex channel situation. I'd be interested to hear what Mike and Alessandro have got to say about that. But essentially, if you ignore the supplier active side of it and just talk about the production of the product, and then downstream from there, you've got distributors, you've got retailers like pharmacists, you've got hospitals, clinics, and you've got the patient. And in the end, the only person that matters in this whole stream is the patient. So what I'm arguing here is that the pharmaceutical industries have really got to go to their patients who are buying their particular medicines, and some of them are very, very expensive medicines for, cancer and all sorts of diseases, and segment the patient. That's where the patient centricity comes from. Now, you've got to know about that, even if you're not going to be fulfilling to them. That's the other problem, that even though we will find that some pharmaceutical companies will go direct to the patient and to the right to their bedside and to the administration of sophisticated drugs in the future, and even surround that with services like nurses and things to go with it, a lot of the fulfillment has to go through intermediaries. So, and intermediaries have a different series of objectives. They're not the same as patients. So producers, pharmaceutical companies, are really the channel captains, and they've got to start to know the patient market very well and segment it along behavioural lines, and then also understand the intermediaries and what their particular buying behaviours are, and trying to influence them on how they present and fulfill their products into the different levels. So it's segmentation, Roddy, at different levels, if you like, in the channel. But the important one is the patient, and that will then inform maybe your channel strategy. I think there's two big elephants in the room, if you like, out there at the moment, and one of them we've touched upon already, and that is the organisation design idea that Martin talked about. But secondly, it's channel strategy, because channel strategy over the years is a commercial strategy that companies have got involved in to, either represent through a sales force and or through, fulfilling the product. And many of these arrangements haven't been really overhauled in years, and they really need to be reviewed to see whether they're still relevant in the sort of world we now live in and the sort of customers and the buying behaviours. And the only way you can get any sense of what makes sense is to work with your commercial marketing sales colleagues and go and do the segmentation in the patient area, user level, and then work back from there. So I think, my view is that, and my view, Roddy, I was looking at some of the terminology here and trying to make it all fit. The resilience question is right through the supply chain, and the fascinating thing that we've found from our research that up to 40 to 50% of business in many industries, and I haven't done the numbers in the pharmaceutical yet, although we are looking at it right now, is very stable demand. You're working with collaborative customers who are buying the same stuff all the time. You're working with transactional customers who won't share data with you, but at least they've got patterns. And so what we're arguing is, try and sort of take that stable demand and take it out, and then leave yourself with the 60% that's volatile, and then work with that to try to manage it through agility and through extreme, fully flexible supply chain. So, as you know, my view is that, and we've done this work across many industries, is that we can get about an 80% fit in most markets by identifying the 4 or 5 dominant buying behaviours present in those markets for the particular products we're talking about. And that's where we get the collaborative supply chain and the lean supply chain, both of which actually you don't need a lot of agility because it's so stable and it just runs on. But when you then get into project type work, which is very lumpy, or you get into this very volatile agile stuff, and then into the extreme disruption that we're now suffering from, then you need lots and lots of capability to build fast and creative supply chains. And then to do that, we need to understand what's happening there, and then go back, using that as our frame of reference, then go back inside and try to mirror image our organisation design and the subcultures that we build into our business to drive those different supply chains. Because the bad news I can tell you is that from our work is that even if you've got a beautiful blueprint and you know what you're doing and you've done all the segmentation work and you've worked out what your operational strategies are, unless you've come to grips with the how can I call it, the genetic engineering of your organization and create subcultures that underpin lean and agile and fully flexible, you get incredible slippage between what you say you're going to do and what you actually deliver in the marketplace, between 40 and 60% slippage. And that's the great crime, because we've got companies out there who are, sort of know what to do, but because of the internal cultural resistance inside their organization, they're not achieving the potential that they are setting up. So there's I think it's already been mentioned, we've got to work not only on the outside, but we've got a lot of work to do on the inside. And my great criticism of universities around the world is they don't teach this stuff. They hardly ever touch upon the cultural implications of organizations and how it plays out in implementation and, you know, acquisitions and things of that nature. So we've got a long way to go in that area.
Thank you very much, John. And, you know, let's hope that this this webinar and this panel is some sort of inspiration to universities, because, you know, we're making a big effort to make this as public as possible. I mean, I think every one of you have emphasized every single point in the credo, whether it's, you know, not building your business in a concrete block by automating it, by looking at the right metrics, by being able to sense and respond to changes that are happening on the demand side. So every element of the credo is embedded in it. And I left Alessandro for the last and the dessert here, because, you know, Alessandro has a great article out there in the Wall Street Journal where he and Merck are building a network of partners, and those partners are able to share data. They have, in Professor Howley's words, smart and insightful visibility of what's happening on the demand side. And I'm certainly not implying that technology has all the answers, but it's a very deep part, as I think we're going to hear from Alessandro. It's a very big part of the enabling solution. So, Alessandro, without, you know, putting pressure on you, over to you.
No pressure, Roddy. We are friends, so we know how to deal with it. So, no, joke apart. First of all, thanks for the nice words. And I'm going to echo a lot of comments being made by my colleagues here in the panel. But if we go back to history and in a certain way learn from best practice, I recall when we were designing the so-called consumer-driven supply network in P&G. That was pretty simple. I mean, at the end was we should synchronize and balance product flow, information flow, and cash flow. Let's get it there, and then let's start designing, because that's very interesting what some of you said, I think it was John and Martin. Let's start designing the supply chain from the outside in. We call it shelf backwards. This is exactly the right thing to do. So fundamentally, I mean, if we try to understand and do the same for pharmaceutical, just copy and paste, we should start from the shelf backwards, and we should synchronize the product, information, and cash flow. Now, that's very simple to say, but it's absolutely challenging to do it, because first of all, where are the shelves? I mean, are we talking about the patient? I mean, John put it very clear. I mean, the customer demand is very different in pharma, because the user, the patient, is different from the prescriber, that is the HCP, different from the payer, can be the insurance, different from the distributor. So it's a little bit more fragmented and segmented way of understanding the real demand. And then also, I mean, I love what you said it. I mean, pharma and healthcare are probably one of the most advanced sectors in terms of technology, but then supply chain is extraordinarily behind. So let's leverage it in a positive way. I mean, going back from my experience from P&G Merck, we try to implement what we call self-driving supply chain. And self-driving supply chain indeed try to capture this concept. So first of all, serve the patient. So design from the demand of the patient backwards. Secondly, leverage real-time information, one single source of truth, that I think was mentioned at the beginning by Mike, that I want to echo again. I mean, real-time information is a must. I mean, it's for me definitely a given. And then with this self-driving supply chain, we wanted to be predictive and drive agility throughout the overall network. Again, that was fantastic. I mean, a lot of progress and so on and so far. But like some of you have said it, the real challenge is the mindset. I mean, it's not the technology, it's not the willingness, it's really the mindset to drive this sort of collaboration, breaking the silos across single element of supply chain. And whoever has worked in pharma, and MAEVE has been working, Mike, and so on and so forth, they know that the history of legacy of creating silos, different stakeholder, doesn't help all of us. I mean, if I see a fast-moving consumer good, I've seen those for 20 years, these are very lean. If I see a pharma supply chain, these are very heavy because, again, it's one step after the other. I think we need to create a flow. That's why I truly believe in the credo. And what you all said is absolutely spot on. The moment is now. The moment is really now. Let's leverage this crisis. Never waste a crisis, or let's leverage this crisis to exploit it. Let's leverage the technology. I mean, the technology, I repeat myself, the technology level where we have today to get real-time information across any system, end-to-end supply chain is amazing, but let's implement it. But we need a change of mindset. We really need a change of mindset to drive it, and this is very important. And the change of mindset means also what Martin said, building the capabilities. And this building the capabilities is a fundamental step change, because when I talk with my colleague and peers, we believe that we have the capabilities. In reality, when you see other industry, the capabilities are totally different. I mean, what are today supply chain planners in other industry are supply chain architects. What today are demand forecaster in other industry are control tower officer. So it's really like embracing the step of technology and changing, continuously upgrading the capabilities of the people. That is the way to go. And I like it very much also what RODDY said. I mean, we shouldn't leverage technology for automation. We should leverage it for augmentation of the skills in order to have really the next supply chain. And I think that's what it's all about, this credo. That's why I truly believe into it. And that's why we are all full of energy and passion to really drive it forward. But we will face a lot of barrier and mindset, and not invented here, I can tell you, inside, outside. So only joining forces, we can really move forward.
Fantastic points, Alessandro. And I realize this has been really intense, and the information content we've all shared. So I'm going to ask you very quickly, because we don't have a ton of time, to each of you just come up with a stop, start, and continue. And, you know, we should be able to cycle through this really quickly, and I'll sum up with 3 points. But the insights from each of you have been incredible. So let's start off with Mike, a stop, start, and continue, and then we'll just follow through the rest of the team.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of what I had here is going to really echo a lot of the conversations that have taken place here over the last hour or so. But when I think about why do we need to start, and this is to pick up with where Alessandro left off, we really have to start utilizing technology. We've got to do it in a way that there's a lot of information there in our systems, but we got to start leveraging the technology so that we can look across the end-to-end supply chains, both internally, externally, really understand what are all those constraints that can disrupt patient supply at the end of the day. And having that real-time data, that single source of truth that Alessandro and I have talked about. And by doing that and pulling that information together quickly in a real-time manner, that really lets us leverage our most valuable assets, our associates. They shouldn't be spending their time trying to get that data and compile that data. That should, we should leverage systems and technology to do that. And that lets those individuals then really apply their insights, that diverse experience that they bring to organizations towards really agile and effective decision-making. So from a start perspective, very much so in utilizing technology. I'd say from a stop, this is to, echo what's the theme that's been throughout. And it sounds simple and sounds, very basic, but stop working in silos. You continue to see that over and over again in organizations, and it sounds really simple, but I've been in the industry for 30 years, and we've been talking about stopping working in silos for 30 years, and I'm sure it went on well before then. So I think that, to me, that really gets back to, it's really about having a global mindset, and it's changing culture. if you really want to make a meaningful and lasting change and breaking down how we work and not working in silos, you have to change a culture within an organization. Breaking down silos is easy. Changing a culture in an organization is quite challenging and much more difficult to do. But I think that's going to be critical for organizations going forwards as we really transform our supply chains. And then from a continued basis, I think it's really to continue to evolve our supply chains. Like we said, and I talked about before, and it's come up on more than one occasion, it isn't a one and done event. There's going to always be other influences out there, whether it be technology, future pandemics, geopolitical influences, climate change, the list I could go on for a long time here probably. There's many influences that are going to continue to impact our supply chains in the future. And we can't think this is a one and done event. We have to continue to be thinking this way. We have to continue to be thinking about how do we evolve our supply chains if we want to continue to be agile and resilient well into the future. So a few thoughts from my side of things.
Very, very, very good points. Thank you very much, Mike. Maeve?
Yeah, I have a few things. I'll try to be brief. So for me, healthcare is very much life and death. And I don't think that we think enough about that, that if the supply chains don't function, that people are dying. I mean, and this is an even bigger reality in low middle income countries. So for me, the first stop would be stop letting bureaucracy, whether it's within businesses or whether it is within governments, let's stop, the levels of bureaucracy that we have in moving innovation forward. And I think we've seen from this pandemic that we can make these decisions much quicker. So let's hope that we can continue to do that. The start for me would be data democratization. I feel that currently, if we want patient-centric supply chains, data is a key part of it. But there has been an awful lot of abuse of data, and there's an awful lot of lack of trust. I, as a patient, I, as an individual, do not feel that if I give away my data, that it is being used responsibly. And I think that many people feel like that. So until we get to a point, I feel we need to get to a point of where people trust that if their data and information is used, that it is being used responsibly and it is not being used for commercialization. And when we do that, I feel that there will be higher adoption of technology, and I think that there will be a lot more insights that can be garnered. The continuing one for me is around upskilling. And I do think that there is a focus on the new generation supply chain people, especially around digital tools and all of that. But when we think about upskilling, I don't think it should just be within the universities, because I do agree with John. I think the universities are way behind where they need to be. But it also needs to be within businesses, across businesses, mentoring, coaching. But I also feel we need to be looking at the upskilling of organizations, capacity building of organizations, and also we need to see capacity building in markets. Again, in low and middle incomes, we see countries, we see a lot of market failures within the healthcare system. And some of those are even around logistic services. They're even around cold chain management and all of that. So I feel that when we should continue the capacity development, but it should be extended beyond people to include organizations and include markets as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Maeve. Martin.
Thanks, Roddy. Well, I'll keep this brief. I think there's many things we should be stopping, but probably I would say let's stop using the sort of mindset and the metrics of the past. And that in a way sort of takes me into what we should be starting to do, because I think the starting point has to be this transition from a forecast-driven way of doing business and running a supply chain to a demand-driven approach. And that, of course, as we've all said, is easier said than done. But I mean, that we have to start it, and there is no question to that. And if we want to think about what we should continue to do, well, I think lots of organizations have actually made significant progress in trying to move towards a much more, well, let's call it a horizontal approach to their organization rather than the vertical organization. And what we should be seeking to do is to continue that process to integration, to move it beyond the four walls of the business, upstream into our supply base and downstream into our customer base, because that is ultimately the foundation, I think, for a real agile capability.
Fantastic points. And again, I think every one of you have emphasized, and trust me, we went through lots of debate on what was applicable in the Credo, what was a real elephant in the room, what was an insight, and what was just nice to have. So well said. Next, Amira, let's hear from you on supply chain risk and your perspective.
Sure, I will keep this really brief. I think I would say stop getting caught up in current crises. And what I mean by that is that supply chain risk management shouldn't be a tool to manage an event when it happens, right? So we need to move beyond that, and we need to start designing our supply chains for resilience. And all of those things that we've discussed today, you know, the foundations of resilience are responsiveness, it's agility, it's velocity, is to have an outside-in view, you know, being closer to our demand, understanding our patient needs, and so forth. And for continue, I would say continue to be adaptable, because after COVID-19, there'll be another disruption. And this is why I say we need to stop dealing with it as a current crisis. There'll be other issues that will disrupt our supply chain. So we need to invest in ways and approaches that allow us to be adaptable. And I think I'd like to add to that point and say that it's very important. The people in our organizations are so important here. It's about upskilling our people and recognize that we need to allow them to be creative and curious, because we are moving into a world which is very different to the stable one that we've built the old models towards. So there's my three.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. John, over to you.
Thanks, Roddy. Look, stop. I think we've just got to stop this one-size-fits-all sort of mentality that continues on the basis that it's sort of the easiest way to go about things. It's purely flawed, because what it implies is that all customers are the same, and they're not. We know that now. The starting one, I think, it comes back to my main point here, is that we've got to start segmenting out not only our customers, but our suppliers. I mean, one of the big things that's come out of this COVID-19, particularly from our part of the world, we've been relying on China. We've just been going for the cheapest source and everything else, is, you know, the disruption that came in the early days of COVID. And no one really had thought about, you know, what were the expectations of their suppliers? You know, which ones would stick with them through thick and thin, which had capacity to, when things started up again, to increase the supply rate. So I think we can do the sort of things we're talking about doing on the front end, which is to understand the deep-rooted expectations of our customers when we segment them for whatever product or service we're talking about. We should be doing exactly the same thing on the back end, on the supply base. And you know, I think this is a fantastic area, because procurement is one of those areas that really annoys me, because it's stuck out there in most companies. It's not even under the supply chain. It probably reports to the CFO. They're getting all the wrong metrics. They're not part of the supply chain. They're looking this way, and the rest of us are looking that way. Nothing's connected. And there are companies where that's not the case. I mean, Schneider Electric's a great example, where the executive director has procurement, logistics, and manufacturing underneath him. But that's not so in many companies. And I think the other thing is that we've got to recognize, when we do this segmentation, it's about understanding the deep-rooted expectations and values of people, which, by the way, don't change very much. We're all hardwired. So if we can find out what, you know, your attitude to buying a car or buying medicine or buying airline tickets is, it doesn't change that much. This is where you can reduce some of this complexity. But I think a lot of people start using opinion-based stuff like Net Promoter Score, which is really, if you do a survey this week and you do it next week, you get a different answer from the customer. So you can't design supply chains on that sort of short-termism. And the third thing, as far as continuing, is I agree entirely. We've got to underpin everything we do with a really strong analytics capability. I make the point that if you're $1 billion company and you don't have a strong analytics department and you haven't got a strong network modeling department, you're already going backwards, right? And I said that to the folks at Schneider Electric 8 years ago, and they took me up on it, and they developed both of them, and both of those capabilities have been fantastic. So it's getting that analytics capability, and of course with that comes that huge task of harmonizing your data. If there's another elephant in the room, and I hope my colleagues in the various pharma companies here will agree with me, it's got to be the master data file and the data. It is a huge task which no one seems to want to own inside the company, and we've got to start getting on top of that, because if we don't, we'll never be able to get the visibility we need and build end-to-end digitalization and take account and use control towers, for God's sake, to do all this stuff to give us the sort of resilience we need. So, you know, there's plenty to do, Roddy.
That's for sure. And, you know, I can almost hear Alessandro laughing in my head, right? Because I worked with Procter & Gamble when I heard Keith Harrison say, you know, we're doing a great job in procurement, but they're getting in the way of us being responsive to demand, right? So that's exactly what has been said on this. And you know, there's a reason I put you as fullback, sweep, third man, whatever position you want to play on the field, Alessandro. And that's because over to you, to your stop, start, and continues.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I will be to the point. Stop is all the silos culture. I mean, inside the company, outside the company, across all the players in the supply chain. We need to stop it. Start, we need to leverage, we said it, my colleagues, digital, advanced analytics, data, link to the agile mindset. Is not one or, is both, is technology and mindset. And then continue, we'll need to continue to focus on patients. I mean, we are always talking about it, we are doing something, we need to continue to focus on patients.
Fantastic. So, you know, thank you very much for all of that. And let me just conclude, and I don't want to leave any points out. I could spend an hour just concluding what each of you have said. But I think what's been very evident is, you know, if you think patient-centric, and I think, John, you brought up a very valid point about, hey, downstream is complicated. This is not a shopper shelf. And this is not just, you know, distribution to the shelf. This is different parties, different politics, different games, and all of the downstream players. And we've got to iron out that visibility in the data and the insights to that downstream supply chain. And if you don't start with segmentation, where do you start, right? So I think that data downstream, you know, not painting ourselves into a corner with systems, as the Credo clearly spells out, let's augment people with systems and data. Let's give them the insights they need to run end-to-end supply chains. And let's start off by thinking patient-centric. So, you know, I think this has been an invaluable collection. If this was a book, I'd be on Amazon right now placing my order. So I want to thank you all very, very much for making the time available. Let's hope this goes viral. As I said, this is technology agnostic. This is vendor agnostic. You know, ISPE are interested. I have had a number of the biotech institutes that are interested in airing this. So it's been absolutely worth the effort. And thank you all for participating. And with that said, goodbye from Boston all the way around to Sydney. Enjoy yourselves and the weekend ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Roddy. Bye.